So can you help the audience place I Can't Imagine Tomorrow within the context of Williams's life? We know that the story was very meaningful for him. In 1981, in a letter to Greg Mosier, then the artistic director of the Goodman Theater, he said that the woman's story from I Can't Imagine Tomorrow was a perfect description of how he felt since the death of his lover, Frank Merlo, nearly 20 years earlier. What makes this play pivotal for Williams and for his canon?
Hi there. Can everyone hear me? Okay. This play was written in 1966, and it was first done for television in 1970 with Kim Stanley. And in 1963, Williams's lover, a partner of 11 to 14 years, depending on when you think they broke up, died. And Williams had said that this was a point in his life where he was taking more and more drugs, he was more and more drinking more and more, and he was extremely depressed. And so in 1969, he finally had a nervous breakdown. And he was in Barnes Hospital in St. Louis for 3 months. So the 1960s, which he called his stoned age, was a period of depression, anxiety, and the story that the woman tells in I Can't Imagine Tomorrow, Williams said, echoes exactly how he felt after the death of Frank. He felt lost, he couldn't talk to people, he felt that his whole world had fallen apart. And what I find interesting about that was that Frank died in 1963, and in the story, the man comes 20 years too early, and Williams actually died in 1983, 20 years later. So in the 1960s, it wasn't just that he was getting depressed, but he was also changing his style, and that was deliberate. I mean, he certainly had moments of lucidity. And a lot of his plays were the language was very truncated, he wasn't completing sentences, and a lot of that fragmentation reflected the fragmentation of not being able to connect with people, but it was very deliberate. And critics at the time were saying Williams can't finish his sentences, he's drunk, he's not coherent, and that wasn't it. He was deliberately trying to recreate this idea of the gap, an inability to connect with other people. And this was one of the plays where he started doing it. One of the things we were talking about earlier was the imagery in the play. And there's a lot of white. And in 1957, 58, he met Yukio Mishima, the writer, the Japanese writer, and he went to Japan and he started getting into no plays and kabuki and a lot of other Japanese theater, and so there's a lot of Japanese imagery in this play. And you have the white cranes on the lawn, also the white silk robe. In some productions, the ice cream suit is white. And the white cranes in Japanese mythology symbolize loyalty, fidelity, a very special kind of connection, which you can see in the play, but also communion with the gods and a transition from darkness to light. So you can see all that sort of imagery in the play and how that works out, and Thomas might want to talk about how many of the plays of the 1960s have that kind of Japanese imagery.
They did. You can trace it from the time he started taking the trips with Mishima. From the late 50s through the 1960s, you see elements of it in Night of the Iguana, The Day on Which a Man Dies, which is a piece that's related to In the Bar of a Tokyo Hotel that was done in 1969. The Milk Train doesn't stop here anymore.
As the kabuki stagehands.
And with the kabuki stagehands. The other thing that sort of was parallel and sort of happened at the same time as Frank Merlo's death is that Williams had reached a point, he'd been in the public eye since about 1940, and about 15 to 16 years since Glass Menagerie was a hit. And after Cat on Roof in 55, the critics never quite gave him those rave reviews again. Looking back on them, there's some very strong plays, Orpheus Descending and Sunday Last Summer and Sweetbury of Youth, but critically speaking, people tend to forget, I think in part because they were made into successful films, that those plays didn't run too long on Broadway, and he was kind of on the outs with the critics. And then the last critical success he had was Night of the Iguana. And after Iguana, it wasn't a black and white split where he just suddenly changed the way he was writing. He actually had experimental impulses all of his writing life, and you see that in Glass Menagerie and in Streetcar and a lot of the plays. But he reached a certain point where he just finally started writing for larger productions and for public consumption what he wanted, being more experimental. And you see that in The Milk Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore. And then his next, and that was a big flop. There were 2 Broadway productions, and they didn't work out at all. It's since been done successfully by several companies. And then the next thing he tried on Broadway was a pair of one-acts under the collective title Slapstick Tragedy, that the critics they didn't just dislike them, they were angry. Like, why are you writing this stuff? Why aren't you? And one of them, the critics said, why don't you write something like A Streetcar Named Desire? So they're literally telling him, we don't like what you're writing, write something else. And so he continued to experiment during the rest of the next 15, 16 years of his life. And if you look at it statistically speaking, Williams wrote as many plays after Night of the Iguana as he wrote before. As many full-length plays and about twice as many one-acts. He was much more productive. But during those later years, because he was critically on the outs, because his drug and alcohol use had become public, because he was severely depressed, everybody around him was freaked out. Every time they did a Broadway play, it was just going to be a hit by Tennessee Williams. And they were stressed, he was stressed, the actors were stressed. And so it's been, since he died, that people are going back and looking at some of these plays to see how do they actually work. And I Can't Imagine Tomorrow is one of them. It was done first, the television production that Annette mentioned, and then the first time it was done professionally was 1986, 3 years after Williams died, directed by Michael Kahn with the acting company. And then Michael Kahn did it again at Manhattan Theater Club, I think in 2004. But it's not seen too often, and so these plays are just beginning to have a life that they didn't have before.
The first time I saw this play was in 1989 at the George Street Playhouse, and it was done with 2 men. And that was, I had never read it before, and it was the first time I saw it, and it worked beautifully. It worked very well, and I didn't realize that that had been a deliberate choice at the time.
And by the way, it was a beautiful job tonight. Congratulations to the actors.